it's more selective. So investors get more picky. You have to prepare your startup more. You cannot just simply show a PowerPoint. You need to show a product. You need to be on the market. What we now see also is an effect that foreign investors are looking to Europe as a safe harbor because they say there's so much uncertainty to deploy capital in the US or in other regions.
The past few years have been difficult, even existential ones for startups around the world. Borrowing became more expensive and investors more cautious. So where are we now? I recently had a conversation with someone who has an idea, Christian Bauer. He's head of InnoEnergy for Germany, Austria, and Switzerland. That's an EU-affiliated organization that essentially connects venture capital with startups in the clean tech area. But a lot of what Christian says applies to startups across the board. Have a listen. Let's go right into it. As I said, the world of climate tech startups isn't where it used to be. That money was a lot easier to find, relatively speaking, maybe 2021, 2022. Then interest rates rose. We had the war in Ukraine. How does that make your job right now? How difficult is it? Where do you see things right now?
So in a portfolio like we have around 160 portfolio companies all over Europe in renewables, in energy storage, in battery tech, hydrogen and the like. And what I see is you always have in your portfolio some shining stars, right? You don't have to do a lot. They are just in the right one or you have a trend there. Then you have a portfolio, you have, I call it now a mid-performing portfolio size, and some you really have to nurture. Yeah. And the biggest topic is, as you rightfully pointed out, is available financing situations in that phase, specifically after a so-called Series A, so in a growth phase, which is right now, in our view, missing, because there was a big hype, 21, 22, which now also decreased over the last 2 years.
I want to sort of flesh that out a little bit. I read recently consultant firm PwC estimates that global financing for climate tech fell 29% from late 2023 to late 2024. I'm just curious, because we followed some of these companies as well. We reported on some of them. How much of what there was at that time was hype and wishful thinking? How much was the sector really penetrated by easy money, wishful thinking? How would you describe it?
I don't see it so black and white, to be honest, because I also had the latest figures now for 2025. So we had a drop in investments in venture and growth in Q1. So it went down in Europe to 1.8 billion. But in Q2 now, we had a revamp of 2.5 billion. So I see the big investment themes are still the same. Software, digitalization, clean tech or energy tech. And now comes a bit more defense and infrastructure, what we see. And I think, so the pockets are there. The industry is there, there's also capital there. The deployment is different. And investors would look rather to write bigger checks to companies that are already profitable, have revenues, have a customer track. And that's where we kick in, because in every country that we serve for our portfolio, we have 2 sales managers just serving customer requests to our startups. Yeah.
But it is fair to say that there's been a substantial change from the years before to right now. That same report, one of the analysts or one investor said mediocre startups were essentially being culled out. Investors were not as interested in what may have passed earlier for them. Is that not a good thing, ultimately, if they're being a bit more scrutinizing and maybe they're putting money in better, more capable startups? Do you see it that way?
Yes. I would say, in general, I would agree, because I think there was potentially too much investments, too much money. Also, valuations rose too early, too high. And then you have a later problem to catch up. So I see this has been reasonably now adjusted. But again, my main message is there is still a lot of capital flowing in, but it's more selective. So investors get more picky. You have to prepare your startup more. You cannot just simply show a PowerPoint. You need to show a product. You need to be on the market. I think that's an important thing.
I'll stop talking about the past in just a moment, but could you have just shown a PowerPoint in 2021 and 2022? I mean, did some charismatic startups make a lot of money because there was a lot of money there?
There was craziness out there, I have to confess, but I think the true value investors always valued really substance. And this is what I see also right now in our portfolio. We have companies like InnoEnergy, a young company that just raised 8 million, oversubscribed. So doing a great job in interacting with investors. Or ECOP, also a new heat pump for industrial, first of a kind, also just closed 11 million. So that's all happening. But again, I agree, the upward and downward trends you see everywhere, and we have just had it in climate tech.
Many countries are still staying on that path towards the Paris climate goals, so they have every reason to push technology. You know, when we look at sort of where we are right now, given that energy, well, actually, let me go back. What are the startups that are luring investors right now? You mentioned several of the ones that you have in your portfolio, but do they look the same as they did in 2021, 22 in terms of the sectors? Are we talking hydrogen, battery storage, energy distribution? What is it?
It's right now shifting a bit. So there are a couple of trend topics. For example, we just had a big fair where we presented a lot of our startups around the topic of data center and how you deal with energy, because the NVIDIA chips, as you know, consume a lot of energy. So we have now products in the battery supercapacity space, like skeleton technology, like in the heating and cooling space, that are all of a sudden very hip because a lot of data centers are being deployed in Europe, in the US, and everywhere. So I see that. So it's a lot around right now grid services, cybersecurity, stabilization of the grid, as we have more renewable power coming or being deployed in Europe, and how to stabilize that. So we see that. So there are some conventional firms that were there in 21, 22 that just now shift to new customers, like a data center, have been a customer before, and some new are really into that. So we see a bit more hesitance in the general sphere of hydrogen. There has been a big hype. But we see also at the same time, and we are doing that, first of a kind applications like green steel, which are very much of interest, and also green fertilizers. We just founded a company in France and Spain who is producing green fertilizer, which is great.
There's so much enthusiasm around AI in particular right now. Have these startups been able to leverage that as well?
Yes. So in a nutshell, yes. And also with content. Like my example, so InnoEnergy, they trade renewables. So they have two trends now. They are like an artificial intelligence software company. And at the same time, they improve, if you are someone who has an energy storage system, they improve your the revenues you can generate. So they are having that. They're deploying now in Germany, and a great example of that.
When we look at politically how the fundamental conditions in Europe have changed over the past few years since the outbreak of the war in Ukraine, rising energy costs, as I mentioned earlier, a bit more skepticism politically about the cost of the transition to renewables, especially here in Germany, where a lot of those costs have been put on the cost of electricity. How does that change the work of climate startups and the attractiveness of climate startups who need to exist in that background of an energy transition? Does it make it more difficult? Is the mood sort of changing?
It's strangely quite the opposite. And the reason being the discussions we're having right now in the US, where obviously sustainability goals are being pulled back, where in the European Union or in, the European Commission gives a clear framework for industrializing clean tech in Europe, with clear targets of, for example, in solar, 40% must come from Europe, produced in Europe. And also subsidies and grants coming from the European Commission for that. So what we now see also is an effect that foreign investors are looking to Europe as a safe harbor, because they say there's so much uncertainty to deploy capital in the US or in other regions. We deploy now capital in Europe, and our startups obviously benefit from that.
Are some of your startups, though, affected by that unclear situation in the US when it comes to climate goals, or I should say one that's completely changed from what it was?
Luckily, 99% of our startups are in Europe. So we have one or two examples, and one even controversial example, GDI, it's a graphene anode manufacturer, just decided to put now their production to Germany instead of deploying it to the US. So we see also that effect happening right now in our portfolio, but as we are predominantly in Europe, we are unaffected of that.
You're something of a matchmaker between money and startups in need of that money. We always hear about how much easier it is to raise large sums of money in the US and China, obviously, very different political and economic system, than it is in Europe, which is fragmented amongst so many nations with different regulations. Give us an idea of what it looks like, how big an impact that makes.
It's, I would say, an impact of 5 to 10 times on the capital distributed. When you look at the number, for example, last year in growth venture capital, there was like 8 to 10 billion deployment in Europe. It was about 90 billion in US. So just to compare and contrast. I think what Europe has done well, we closed the gap in early financing. Yeah, so-called seed, so after university.
Nurturing these startups.
Nurturing the startup, we are good. You can get financing 5, 10 million. But then when it comes to a 20 million, 30 million ticket, there was always the way to US or Middle East. So I think this is really something we should work on to close that gap.
Why is that such a problem? Is it just the sums of money? Is it the patience that investors have to have? What is substantial about that difference?
There are different reasons for that. One is we don't have or had the boom like you have seen in Silicon Valley with a lot of billionaires being created out of Facebook, Meta and others, which then deployed their capital again into young companies. So we did not have that yet. And Silicon Valley also took 25, 30 years to be restricted. Second thing is venture capital in Europe is not yet seen as a stable financing class. What does it mean? In US, also Canada, you have rather conservative institutions like a pension fund or an insurance company.
Institutional investors would call them.
Exactly, that invest directly in that class. For Europe, that's still too risky. So I think guarantees could help by the national or European side to de-risk that, to mobilize that capital. I think that's really needed.
What about family offices? In a country like Germany, you have so many family-run businesses that are quite successful, that often fly under the radar because they're privately held, but that often have family offices. That is, they invest the profits from the family, run business over time, and they can put them into startups if they wanted to. Is there any progress in developing that kind of fundraising for startups, to plowing more of that into new technology?
Definitely. So I've seen also an increase in family office investments, also throughout our landscape, which is quite promising. And you see, for example, also one of the big family offices in Germany has founded the Munich cluster called Unternehmertum, where you see a lot of now startups coming out, being nurtured out of family money. So yes, I see that trend. The question is still, can those family office and they support heavily right now the early industry, but the later one.
So again, this problem of so much money going into the early stages, but not into the late stages. I have to ask about battery systems. Battery storage is one thing that we hear a lot about, but it's always unclear exactly how far this technology is developed. What do you see in terms of the startups in this area, and how promising are the technologies?
Yeah, we are quite proud because in our portfolio we have around 40 investments, and we always invest along value chains. Yeah? That means we have participations in raw material companies, in components, battery cell manufacturing. So we built, for example, together with Renault, Verkor, which is a gigafactory now in France. So we don't hesitate to invest in hardware, and also into distribution channels around that. So overall, the EV electrification trend will continue. The energy storage and battery storage trend we see now as I would call it buffer for renewables will continue. So there is a big hype around that, and our portfolio is well suited for that. What has now to happen is, specifically now in Europe, is we need those node points, so-called grid points, to also bring in battery storage in. UK has done a good advancement there in the last couple of years. They have now more than 20 gigawatt in battery storage installed. In Germany or Europe, we are lacking, they're still behind. So we need this grid connection to add battery storage, also to buffer the renewables when there is potential less wind or less sun available.
Where is the bottleneck there? Where is that being held up? Is that rules? We often hear so much about bureaucracy in countries in Europe, especially in Germany. How would you describe it?
So right now, simply the pipeline is too long. I think there are around 600 to 800 applications on different node points, and those have to be now filtered. And just the Ministry of Economics said they will now prioritize those, because in the past it was first in or first out, and so it takes a lot of time, and some applications are maybe false or not valid anymore.
Or placeholders for
someone. So I think we have to work on that, and I think the TSOs and DSOs have to really invest in the infrastructure and in the grid right now to add more node points. And The other thing is what we are also doing, we have a company called Repono, who is really now installing battery capacity, maybe also on co-locations. Maybe you have a solar renewable farm, and you just add simply, and you have already grid connections, you add the battery storage next to it. This is what we see now a lot happening, and where there is right now a lot of money also in.
Interest rates are coming back down. That at least is good. We have a war that's still going and this pressure on energy costs. What do you see for the sector in the coming years?
I think the biggest topic is still what you meant in the beginning, energy costs in Germany. So we have a quite high base tariff and then a variable one. I see in that respect more renewables coming. So it's clear we want, for example, also in Germany to achieve 80% renewables. We are at 63 right now. So this is a big topic. And the second one is also that we need flexible energy tariffs, also for B2C and consumers. But the issue is there, we don't have even a smart meter at home. So we have to roll that out. In Scandinavia, you have energy costs of maybe 8 cents per kilowatt hour. In Germany, it's 24 to 35. So that's the big gap because we don't have flex there.
Do you believe the urgency in the government right now matches the priorities of climate tech startups?
It's heard. I would say they have realized that. There was this 10-point paper just brought out by Katharina Reiche 2 days ago, and I looked into that.
That's the economy minister? Mm-hmm.
Yeah, exactly, the Minister of Economy of Germany. And it clearly points out 80% is the target for Germany. We also have to do something in the grid stabilization, so it's heard. And we have to do something in this. The question is always, when is this implemented? So we, as the investors, are also in the startup community are asking, when is it implemented then? Yeah.
All right, that's Christian Bauer. He's head of InnoEnergy for Germany, Austria, and Switzerland. We'll have to leave it there for now, Christian. Thanks so much for coming in.
Thank you very much. Pleasure.